Welcome to the Semi-Retired Podcast with your hosts, Richard Bonomo.
And me, Dave Farrant.
Hey, Dave, how you doing this week?
Well, I'll tell you what, Richard, I've encountered, or uncovered, I should say, two more examples of shrinkflation.
Oh.
You may recall I talked about the Kraft dinner scandal a couple weeks ago. All right, here's two for you. Flamingo chicken wings. My favorite chicken wings. I prefer the spicy crispy, but this applies to all the flamingo chicken wings. I've been buying these things for over a year. Box of 650 grams worth of wings, $16.49. Often on sale, but there's your baseline. I go in the other week to stock up, and I noticed the box looks a bit different. They've changed the packaging. And I noticed that because graphics background, I'm like, oh yeah, I see that, like different color, this and that. Then I also noticed that the box is smaller. So I take a look at this, and I notice that it's gone from a 650 gram box of chicken wings to 550 grams, a substantial decrease. The price, meanwhile, has decreased all of 50 cents. I do the math on this. Turns out my chicken wings just got 15% more expensive per box. And they tried to camouflage it with the packaging redesign like I wouldn't notice. So put that aside, 3 days ago, it being colder now weather-wise, I'm stocking up on Campbell's Chunky Soups, which are great during the winter months, right? And they've got a buy three deal going. So I think I'll pick up 3 soups, and that's great. I'll save some money. Can 1, can 2. I pick up can 3, and it feels and looks a bit different. So I look at it, and I hold it up in my hand compared to the earlier cans I picked up, and it's a bit taller and a bit slimmer. I think that's weird because those cans have been the same forever.
Yeah.
Tell you what, instead of being 540 mLs, it's 515. They suck 25 milliliters, or about an ounce, out of the can of soup, and I think tried to pass it off by making it look taller so it looked bigger. Wow. 5% increase.
5%
I did the math.
increase. Wow.
5% increase.
Yeah, this is almost like an ad for Flamingo and Campbell's, but like a negative ad.
It's got like a negative ad, exactly. You know, you really think I'm not going to notice because you changed the size of the can? Like, we're that stupid?
Yeah, it's wild. They should have left the can the same size, just reduced the milliliters. You never would have noticed.
I agree. I'd have left the can the same size, kept out an ounce. Who would have noticed?
You thought you were getting the tall boy.
Exactly. I was getting the tall boy. Not so much. Okay. So that's been my week.
That's been your week. It's quite a week.
It's quite a week.
So this week, Dave, well, what are we doing?
Well,
besides, comparing soups.
Right. Well, this was your idea, Richard, and I loved it. And what we're looking at is record albums, that are so good that you really should listen to them from A to Z, front to back. Not the kind of record where you don't want to pick off one song, 2 songs. These are worth the listen. And so we both went through and we're both music fans, went through our extensive library of music, and each chose 10. And we're going to talk about why we chose them and recommend them to you, dear listeners, in the hopes that you'll go out there and try them yourself.
That's right.
So, Richard, do you want to get us started?
Okay, so before I start, a small disclaimer. So that we had a few rules on this. You couldn't have more than 1 album per band, obviously.
Check.
No greatest hits or compilations.
Check.
Wow, would that have been a cheat?
Yeah, that's a cheat.
And in my case, you'll notice my 2 favorite bands, the Beatles and Zeppelin, do not appear at all on my list.
Oh, you held back, eh?
It's not that I held back, is that to me...
I was weaker than that.
Is to me, you can play the Beatles from beginning career to end career and never have to skip a song, and I'd say the same thing about Zeppelin.
Well, now I feel badly.
Yeah. That's okay. That's okay. It's just that was in my head. I couldn't pick one disc because to me, I could listen to all of it.
It's a fair point.
So I said, let's pick other things. And I tried, although this is unconscious, I picked stuff from almost every decade, from the 60s through to the 2000s, skipping 1980. Not a pretty era, the 1980s.
The 80s? Yeah.
A lot of bedazzle and men with big hair.
Yeah, as I recall, big hair. I agree. Yeah, I'm kind of front-loaded in the early part of the era, and as much as I wanted to, I couldn't really... Well, there's one that I put on my alternate list that I guess I could have included, but we'll see. I don't want to give it all away now.
Aren't all men front-loaded?
Well, some.
Middle-aged men, sorry.
That's a fair point. Oh, I thought you meant, I see what you mean. Yeah, now I got it, yeah.
It's a different spin.
Different spin.
All right, so for my first album, I have Pet Sounds from the Beach Boys, 1966.
What an excellent choice, Richard.
Yeah. Great album. I went through this whole Beach Boys period at one point. I think it's when Brian Wilson released Smile, his sort of comeback. He hadn't put out anything in like 20, 30 years.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
And on Smile, there are some songs. I think there's a couple of songs that are from Pet Sounds. And so I got back into this whole Beach Boys groove and I started going back to it. Most people know the album Pet Sounds or you've heard it. So I picked up an actual physical CD back then. And I got into this and I started listening and I'm like, wow, what an album this is. What an album. There's no dogs on this album. I'm telling you, everything is just like beautiful. You listen to it from front to back. It's the first mention of God in a song, a popular music, God Only Knows, right? Which was almost controversial when it came out because you weren't supposed to take the Lord's name in vain or whatever. You're not supposed to mention these kind of things. And they did. And of course, it's got some of the great songs are on here. To me, it was just a beautiful... Good Vibrations is on there. What more do you want? I don't see it on the listing here, but it was on my copy of the CD.
Could have been a single that was released around the time of the album.
Yeah,
sometimes you get that.
It is separate, but
Yeah.
on some of the albums, Good Vibrations was on. I think it might have actually been on the previous album. Also, it's on both.
Well, yeah, I'm so glad you chose this album because if you look at the Beach Boys' career, for 3, maybe 4 years, they had been the surfer guys, right? Mm-hmm. Little Surfer Girl, Surfing USA. And then Pet Sounds was Brian Wilson really asserting himself as a producer and wanting to be like the other bands he was hearing stretch out, like the Beatles notably. And in terms of God Only Knows, Paul McCartney, no less a personage than Paul McCartney, not a bad songwriter himself, called God Only Knows the most beautiful song ever written in the English language, he felt.
Really? I didn't
Yeah,
know that.
he
Okay.
did. And they had trouble with it. I think they wanted to release it as a single, did the Beach Boys. They had trouble with it because the record company, and they tended to be more ruled by their record company than maybe some of the other artists. They didn't quite have the strength there. The record company didn't like the I may not always love you part.
Yeah.
Which is the beautiful part of the song.
Yeah.
I may not always love you, but as long as there are stars above you.
Yeah.
And that's the brilliance of the lyric. But they didn't get it. They're like, oh, people are going to be, it's negative, it's depressing. So they moved away from it. And the Beach Boys caved, unfortunately.
Oh, yeah, they caved. Yeah.
But
yeah.
And a psychedelic album, it should be said.
Yeah.
Defined as
Absolutely.
such.
And there's a lot of little intermezzo kind of songs that have no lyrics in between. That like they take you from one song and then you get this little orchestral part and then boom, you're back into the other song.
Yeah.
Beautiful for that. I really like when bands do that. And then Van Halen actually did that on Diver Down on one of their albums. They have
Did they really?
Yeah, they have all these little songs that take you from one song to another, but have no lyrics and are
right.
just a little piece.
Oh, actually, one of mine later on does that. You reminded me, actually. Yeah.
So beautiful. I mean, it ends with Caroline No, which was
so
he
nice,
had a
yeah.
crush on Princess Caroline.
Is that who it
sorry,
was?
Caroline Kennedy.
Oh, Caroline Kennedy.
Yeah,
I
he
see.
had a crush
Okay.
on Caroline Kennedy, so he wrote that song, The Sloop John B. Don't talk, put your head on my shoulder. Wouldn't it be nice?
Oh, I love that song. Yeah.
Wouldn't it be nice? You know,
Yeah.
it's like it's just such a great album. It's got it's very cohesive from start to finish. Just beautiful.
I don't think there's a surfer song on here. Maybe Sloop John B is maybe the closest, right?
The closest. It's more
Talking
of a fishing
about a
song.
sailboat, but yeah, it's a fishing song. But
yeah, exactly. And it's funny. There's a whole anti-police kind of thing in there too.
Oh, is there?
There's a lyric. I forget what he says. Sheriff. He said something about the sheriff or get off my back or something.
Okay.
And I was like, oh, interesting. It's like a little anti-establishment little comment in this kind of happy-go-lucky song, right?
well, I think they found themselves in a weird spot because a lot of the bands were doing that. I mean, the whole music scene was shifting towards like the resistance to the Vietnam War was happening. A lot of bands were kind of like, you think of Buffalo Springfield doing For What It's Worth, which was, I think, later that fall. And the Beach Boys found themselves in this kind of, wearing the pink striped shirt, shaking their asses and doing surf music. And this for Brian wasn't enough.
Yeah.
And I think you can see this odd dichotomy going on.
Well, yeah, and there's the story of Brian wouldn't tour, right? He would stay
Right.
back, he would write the songs, he would do the stuff, and then they'd come back, and Mike Love, I think, was the singer. Is it Mike Love?
Yes.
I think so.
One
and
of, yeah.
Mike sometimes would disagree with the lyrics because it didn't sound poppy enough, and they would have big fights about lyrics, and Mike sometimes on the recordings would sing the version he wanted.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think you got two very different artists there. Mike Love, Mr. Top 40, Mr. This is what made us a success. Let's keep doing that. And Brian, who wanted to be something
Push the
more.
envelope.
Push the envelope, 100%. Yeah,
Exactly.
Break the envelope.
So that's my first. Dave, what's yours?
Okay, so from the prior year, I'm starting off with Bringing It All Back Home by Bob Dylan. Bob Dylan, an artist who is fair to say is certainly, you either love him or hate him. I happen to love him.
Hate him.
Richard, okay, good. This is great. Okay, so now we can really dig in. So, all these years later, we can look back, and Bob Dylan is really remembered for the work he produced between 1963 and 1966. So 3, 4, 5, and 6. There was a bit in 1962. He was a guy from Hibbing, Minnesota, who got himself to New York when he was in his 21, 22, because he wanted to be a folk artist like Woody Guthrie. goes to Greenwich Village, which is where a really bubbling folk scene was happening, and proceeds to make a name for himself early on with songs like Blowin' in the Wind and songs like that. The big innovation being that Bob was writing his own songs. The folk artists at that point were kind of paying tribute to, say, Woody Guthrie.
Yeah.
Bob was a big fan of Woody Guthrie. Bob wrote his own stuff. It was topical. It was of the day, and he became a darling of the folk scene through 1963, through 1964, which coincidentally is while the Beatles are getting big. 63 was the year of Beatlemania in England. 1964, Beatlemania came to the US. And so Bob is noticing this. In fact, each band is noticing the other. Bob is noticing the Beatles' success with the rock and roll music and the young, and he's got this very intellectual, slightly older audience watching him. He wants some of what the Beatles have got. Meanwhile, John Lennon on the other side of the Atlantic wants what some of Bob's got in his lyrics, because Bob was all about the lyrics and dealing with subjects more sophisticated than hands you wanted to hold. By early 1965, as Bob releases Bringing It All Back Home, he's making the transition from acoustic folk artist, so Bob and a guitar and his harmonica, to Bob with a band. So Bringing It All Back Home actually has an electric side, notably side 1, and an acoustic side 2. You can listen to this thing from top to bottom, and you hear an artist who's growing and stretching out. It kicks off with the famous Subterranean Homesick Blues. Johnny's in the basement mixing up the medicine. I'm on the pavement thinking about the government. Just goes on and on for 2 minutes. It's just a brilliant sort of pop expose of kind of like, it's talking about the man and, don't follow leaders, watch parking meters. And it's electric, which would have been shocking and was shocking to his audience. Goes through some beautiful songs. Love Minus Zero, No Limit is a beautiful love song. Maggie's Farm, again, more about, hey, I ain't going to work on Maggie's Farm no more, about breaking out of conventional society. And then on side 2, Mr. Tambourine Man, which went on to become a hit for the Byrds, who electrified it. So you get all these artists kind of cross-pollinating.
That's the version I know of Mr. Tambourine Man is
by the
Byrds version.
Sure you would, with the jangling 12-string electric guitar. Because the Byrds heard this and kind of went, oh, we can electrify this. Yeah. Bob heard that too. So it's all kind of floating back and forth.
So is this the album where Bob goes electric?
This is the halfway electric album. Later that year, literally a few months later, he does Highway 61 Revisited, fully electric with like a Rolling Stone on it and Ballad of a Thin Man. So at that point, he's got a full band behind him. The band, as it turned out. So this is the album where he makes the transition. And later that summer of 1965, he appeared at the Newport Folk Festival, as he had done for the prior few years, and caused a sensation because he played an acoustic set to the audience, which they were accustomed to. Then he invited his band out and played some electric songs, and he was booed off the stage. And the audience, New York City-based folk audience, they thought electric instruments were for kids. Dylan was a sellout, they turned their back on him, but he moved on and never looked back. And between mid-1965 and the end of 1966, when he had his motorcycle accident and basically withdrew from the public eye, he released, as I mentioned, Highway 61 Revisited, and then Blonde on Blonde, a double album in 1966. And these are considered Dylan's peak kind of psychedelic type albums in the sense that everybody was using LSD by that point or had tried it. So at any rate, this is the transition album, half electric, half acoustic. Not a song on here you won't enjoy, in my opinion. If you don't like Bob's voice, well, I can't help you on that.
So, in one of our last past episodes, I asked if you had to try to convince someone of Bob's greatness or whatever, what one album would you recommend? Now, would this be it?
I think so. That's a good question. I think it would, because again, Love Minus Zero, No Limit is a beautiful love song, as is She Belongs to Me. Mr. Tambourine Man, I think it's just a terrific song. And then you've got things like It's All Over Now, Baby Blue, with not a weak song on the album. I think his virtues as a songwriter and a lyric writer are on full display. So yeah, this would be it. A long way around to get to that point, yes.
Okay, I guess I'll have to grudgingly give it a listen.
Thank you, Richard. Okay, throw it over to you.
Okay, so my number 2 is the band Babe Ruth, not the player, but the band, and their album First Base, which I always love the play there because they're named after a baseball player. Their first album is named after first base, obviously.
Excellent choice, Richard.
Yeah. So this, and you had this on your list too, which I
did.
I didn't realize until you told me. So the big song from this was, of course, The Mexican, which used to play often on the radio, often late at night. You would hear The Mexican come on because it's kind of a long song. It's
very show me, sort of thing.
Very show me. Yeah. I even actually, when I was working,
that's the Montreal FM radio station, by the way, I should say.
One night we had to do an all-nighter in a pharmacy to rebuild something, rebuild the whole section, and I called in to show Shome to request the Mexican.
You did?
And it came on like 2 hours later for the guys working in over at the Cumberland, whatever pharmacy where we're at. Here's the Mexican. And the guys are like, hey, it worked. And
I never did that. Oh, that's great.
And none of them knew the song. I said, I've just requested the Mexican by Babe Ruth. And they're like, what? They had no idea what it was until it came on. Then they all knew the song. It's one of those things. I'd say the Mexican, some of you may not know what it is, but when you hear it, you'll know it. What a great album. It's only got like 7 songs on there. One of which is a Frank Zappa song, King Kong.
Oh, I didn't know that.
King Kong is a Frank, and they do an excellent version. It's just a long jam, and when you hear the piano and the music going through it, you're like, that really is a Zappa song. No lyrics. It's an instrumental.
Oh, that's the instrumental. Yeah, I know it. Yeah,
and just beautiful. Wells Fargo, great song. The Runaways, King Kong, Black Dog, the Mexican.
I love Black Dog so much.
Joker's a good one. Yeah. Wells Fargo.
And how about that vocalist?
Oh, the vocalist. Yeah, she was 17 when the band came out.
Really?
Yeah, she was 17 years old when
Jenny Han, right? Jenny Han, I think her name is.
I think that's it, yeah.
H-A-A-N.
Yes, that's right. H-A-A-N.
Juanita Jenny Han.
And she was 17 at the time.
My God.
It's crazy. And what a great voice she has on that. And that's the only album I ever had by them. I never listened to anything else. It's all I had. And I think a friend of mine had it. And I went through this phase where I had a bunch of newer music. He had a bunch of older music.
Yeah.
So we started trading. So I traded some of my new wave stuff I remember trading for Physical Graffiti by Zeppelin, this one, and a few other albums. So I was able to acquire some most, and I had this on an actual vinyl.
A few episodes ago, talking about rock and roll, you asked me what the first album I ever purchased was. And it wasn't this, but this was in the first 5 that I purchased. Yeah. And I, again, must have heard a song on Shome. How else would we have known? But fantastic. Notably, the artwork on the front cover is by Roger Dean. Oh. The famous English illustrator who did a lot of Yes album covers.
Okay. Yeah, it's got that feel. Eh? Yeah. It's got that feel. Yeah.
Very cool.
Yeah, it's kind of like an underwater, someone's like swinging on the bat.
Yeah, and they're riding on sharks. Yeah, the surfing on sharks.
I was going to say a manta ray, but yeah, it's probably a shark. Yeah, great album.
Terrific album.
So Dave, number 2 for you.
I went ahead and put in a Beatles album, in this case, Revolver, released on the 5th of August, 1966. Why am I being that specific? Because 1966 was such a pivotal year that it almost matters whether an album was recorded or released in the spring versus the fall. To take a look at where the Beatles were at in 1966, they ended 1965 releasing Rubber Soul, which was their first kind of non-Beatlemania type album in the sense that the songs became more introspective. Norwegian Wood, In My Life, songs of that nature. It wasn't all Holding Hands and, From Me to You, which were great in their way, but the Beatles had moved on but were beginning to stretch their legs lyrically and musically. John notably having been influenced by Dylan, as I mentioned, and so wanted to do some of what Bob was doing. We come to Revolver, the only album the Beatles released in 1966. It was the follow-up to their double A-side single, Paperback Writer in Rain, released in April of 1966. So by August, out comes Revolver. Interestingly enough, this is the same month the Beatles performed their last public concert, which was in San Francisco at Candlestick Park. That was the end of their touring career. The next time they would appear in public would be on the rooftop 2.5 years later. So end of that Beatles, and out comes Revolver, which is really like nothing else that existed at that point in music. The lyrical inventiveness, the musical inventiveness was unparalleled, shook the music world, the pop music world to its foundations. It's considered a fully psychedelic album in that the Beatles had tried LSD at this point. 2 of John's songs in particular, She Said, and Dr. Robert, are specifically about acid. She Said is something, apparently John and Peter Fonda dropped acid together in Los Angeles at some point, and Peter Fonda kept saying, John said something like, I can see God, and Peter was saying, she said this, so that became that song. And Dr. Robert was a dentist to at least a couple of the Beatles. They all went there for dinner at his place in late 1965 to Dr. Roberts' apartment to have dinner, and the good doctor slipped a little something special into their coffee, which was the dread lysergic acid.
Really?
And, yes, thus kicking off that whole thing. So you've got that going on. You've got George coming out with Taxman. Very unusual subject matter. He's literally saying like 19 for you. Here's 19 for you. Here's 1 for me, referring to the 95% marginal tax rate in place in Britain at that point. Yeah. And George was always a little more closer to his money than the other guys. So yeah, but a very different kind of subject matter, as was Paperback Writer, as was Rain. Paul has got some beautiful love songs here, there, and everywhere. And For No One, I think are classics. The Motown-styled Got to Get You Into My Life, which Paul did. And then the album caps off with Tomorrow Never Knows.
Oh.
What can you say?
Yeah.
This is John's interpretation of the Tibetan Book of the Dead, Actually, there's more acid in here, sort of thing, you must say. And incorporating very innovative recording techniques.
Yeah, to me, Rubber Soul and Revolver are the peak of
Yes.
the Beatles. Yeah,
100%.
To me, that's them at their most collaborative. There's perfection in there. Whereas then you get Magical Mystery Tour. There's a few things. Yeah. Even Sgt. Pepper to a certain extent. They become concept albums. You get this kind of. But this is straight on music. It's just fantastic. And Tomorrow Never Knows. What can you say? It's probably my favorite Beatles song.
I think Ringo said it was his favorite drum piece that he did.
Oh.
And the other thing is the album cover itself was very innovative. I mean, the Beatles typically just put themselves on album covers. They didn't do anything fancy. Here's the four of us. Here's the four of us. This was an illustration done by
the four of them.
Of the four of them, done by Klaus Voormann, who showed up later as the bass player in the Plastic Ono band and who was a friend of theirs from their Hamburg days.
Oh, really?
So Klaus is an artist. Paul asked him, come up with an illustration. He did. They only paid him £50. And Paul said something like, well, that's all we've got. Or John, I think, said, like, that's all we've got.
You sure it wasn't George?
It might have been George. It should have been George, exactly. And again, it's like such a great album cover. It's like, it's got that fantasy, like dreamlike style to it. So I can't say enough about it. If you had only one Beatles album to take to a desert island, I would take that with its preceding single, Paperback Writer in Rain, and I think that would be enough. Richard.
So for my number 3, we're going to go a little rougher, a little louder, still British. Desolation Boulevard by Sweet from 1974. A friend of mine was a huge Sweet fan. He had all the albums. He was just obsessed with them, constantly. All he ever talked was Sweet. And so this came out in 74. I would have been 10. I still listen to this today, and it's like it takes me right back there. I know the lyrics to all the songs. It starts off with Ballroom Blitz.
I love it.
Who doesn't love Ballroom Blitz, right? And then the 60, and it's a very teenagey album. I mean, I'm not sure how old they were at the time, but the lyrics are very, addressed to a slightly younger crowd. The 16s, obviously. No, You Don't. AC/DC, which is, about a guy who's dating a girl who's also dating a girl.
Aha! Some of that, eh?
Yeah. I Want to Be Committed. Great song.
Yes.
Sweet F. Fox on the Run, which was another one of their big hits.
Love
right?
Fox on the Run.
Set Me Free Into the Night, Solid Gold Brass.
Is that the Kinks Set Me Free, or is it their own Set Me Free?
I think it's their own. I'm pretty sure it's their own.
I only ask because it's got the same title. And
and then they end with a bit more of a funky, Solid Gold Brass, a little more poppy, dancey kind of thing. They kind of went that way a little bit later on. To me, this is pinnacle. This is their third album. There's others that are okay-ish. I mean, you get Love Is Like Oxygen later.
Oh, I love that song.
I think it's another one or two albums later, but those albums are rather, to me, weak compared to this. This is like...
That's peak Sweet.
This is peak Sweet. And if you go early Sweet, really, really bad stuff. Coco, and all these crazy, like terrible freaking things. Look it up. It's just really, really bad British songs with just like weird words. Like the lyrics are just like really, really silly bubblegum stuff.
It's funny how you mentioned it with First Base before Babe Ruth's album. It's funny how some groups have like one album in them and they're done. I mean, because it's your point. I don't think Babe Ruth did anything before or after.
They have 6 albums.
Do they have 6?
Yeah.
I don't know. I've never listened to them. I don't know that they made any impact. Sweet, I think Love Is Like Oxygen was a great song from maybe 2 years after this one, as you pointed out. But it seemed to pour all this energy into like one record.
Yeah,
which is more than I've ever produced, so I shouldn't say anything.
This really was. After this, they went a little more 70s funky.
Okay.
Tried to go folksy, new agey a little bit. Okay. And it's not my favorite.
Right.
But I remember Love Is Like Oxygen would play on the radio, and there was 2 different edits. There was the radio edit, and then there was the full album version, which is much longer.
Okay.
There's a whole bunch of parts in between stuff.
Oh, I know what you're talking about.
And then the radio version's like 2 or 3 minutes long, whatever. And then I think the album version is like 6 or 8 minutes. Yeah. So Dave, for you, number 3.
Okay, I'm only moving forward a year to 1967, although most of this album was recorded in May of 1966. There was a delay. So we're back in 1966, that pivotal year in 60s music. The band is called The Velvet Underground, and the album is called The Velvet Underground and Nico. Nico being a European singer, a woman who worked with them on this particular album, released in early 1967, March, I think. But again, most of the music recorded 10 months earlier. The band was notable because they had a close association with Andy Warhol, and in fact were the house band, I think I could call them that, at this club he had called the Exploding Plastic Inevitable. So we're talking very mid-60s, very avant-garde New York scene. Most of the musical energy in the U.S. at this point was on the West Coast, either in Los Angeles or San Francisco. But over here on the East Coast, New York had the Velvet Underground. This album is considered one of the most influential albums ever released by musical artists in the 20th century. It's 13 on Rolling Stone's top 500 records of all time, and it's recognized as being an album that spawned many musical styles, including punk, including avant-garde, prog rock, all this stuff. I've never heard anything quite like it in my life. The key artist here, the key band member, is Lou Reed. And for those people who are only casual rock and rollers, you'll know Walk on the Wild Side from 4 years later. In the mid-'80s, late 80s, he had a comeback album, did Lou Reed, called Dirty Boulevard, was the hit song, with the hit song Dirty Boulevard on it, and some others, which is worthwhile. In between, he kind of wasn't really top 40, but that's okay. It don't have to be top 40. So back to the Velvet Underground and Nico, it was notable was this album because it explored very dark themes like drug addiction, sadomasochism, bondage, like drug dealers. And Lou Reed, who was, I think, the principal songwriter at this point, I believe he was an English major. So very familiar with literature and liked kind of darker, dingier literature and wanted to bring that aesthetic into rock music, thereby creating the Velvet Underground and Nico. And I think when you look at the song titles like Femme Fatale, Venus in Furs, All Tomorrow's Party, The Black Angel's Death Song, so on and so forth, you get a sense of the flavor of it. You got to listen to it top to bottom. There's a vibe here that you won't get anywhere else. And the Velvets were not a long-lived band. They did another album a year later. There was conflict between Lou Reed and John Cale, his partner. They're also notable are the Velvets.
They're not called the Velveteens?
No, they're not the Velveteens or the Velvetas, but the Velvets. They had a woman drummer. And I can't think of another woman drummer from the 1966-67 era at all. So I think that was...
Karen Carpenter.
A little bit later, yeah. A little bit later. Anybody who's interested in that period or just wants to hear something that is... Actually, I'll say one more thing. Brian Eno, later of Roxy Music and his own musical fame, said of Velvet Underground and Nico that it may have only sold 30,000 copies in the first 5 years, but everybody who bought a copy started a band. Was he exaggerating? I don't know, but
I've heard the story too.
That's my Velvet Underground and Nico review. It's a must-have.
So Velvet Underground is the name of a book, and they got the name for the band from the name of the book.
I should have known that.
Which is called The Velvet Underground by journalist Michael Lee, who was published in '63, so a year before the album came out. Lee investigates aberrant sexual behavior between consenting adults, that is, everything other than simple intercourse conducted in privacy by a heterosexual couple. So it calls right.
I would never clue what he was talking about.
Well, it's right into those themes that you mentioned before, basically, right?
Fair enough.
So I'm going to have to give this a listen. I recognize from the titles, one song, I'm Waiting for the Man.
Oh, yeah, okay. You perhaps would, yeah.
I know it. You won't believe the copy is a copy done by Vanessa Paradis much later, who was Johnny Depp's partner for the longest time, French singer. Yeah.
See, I love the way all this stuff weaves together. Right?
Yeah.
How interesting is 1967? Richard, you're next.
Okay, so I'm going to go with, and I almost forgot this one. Okay, it shocks me. And I was talking to friends on my usual Sunday night call. One of them, I mentioned that we were doing this, and one of them right away instantly named two albums, one of which I had on with, and it's Crime of the Century by Supertramp. Their first big hit, 1974, I think is their third album. I put it on the list, and some of these I put on the list, I'm like, do they deserve to be on the list? So I spent a couple of days, and I would just play the whole thing front to back, and I listened to this, and I went, oh my God, does this ever deserve to be on the list? It is just a phenomenal album from start to finish. I mean, it starts off with School. What a great intro to School with that kind of music, and then the little girl scream, the little kid scream, and bam! So it starts off with School, followed by Bloody Well Right, a bit more of a heavier song, a big guitar riff in that one. Hide in Your Shell, a lighter kind of song, but still really, really good. Asylum, I just love Asylum. It's got such a feel. When you listen to that and the lyrics and the way he sings it, my God, you feel like you're in the asylum. Of course, Dreamer, Rudy to me, I always love Rudy. Rudy's just like, terrific. Rudy's on a train to nowhere halfway down the line, and you just go on, and again, some great freaking awesome music in there. If everyone was listening, a softer song before they take you into Crime of the Century. And I listened to it again the other day. I had the headphones on. Does anyone use the piano as well as Supertramp does on this album in rock music? I don't think there is. Yeah. It is just amazing. And a friend of mine was telling me, this is for you, Brian. I know you never listen, but this is for you. That his son was interested in the piano, and he put on some Supertramp for him, and they said, do you want to see what piano can sound like in music as opposed to listening to a classical piano piece or whatever? And just the way they use piano from its very, light tinkling to some really intense, you listen to the end of Crime of the Century, that whole jam right at the end.
Yeah.
It just gives me goosebumps just listening to it. Fantastic, fantastic album. I bought this at some point. I actually had the vinyl much later than 1974, but I went through my Supertramp period not long after that when Breakfast in America came out. Was that 77, 78, around there?
78 is about
and so
right,
then
yeah.
I went back and I rediscovered all this stuff.
Yeah, I remember Crime of the Century being huge in high school, grade 9 or something. It's like everybody was listening to it. They appeared at the Montreal Forum. Some of my friends went down. They couldn't believe, it was like Supertramp. When I hear those songs, it's one of those albums that can take me right back to that time. It transports me to grade 9. Terrific year, middle year of high school and all that. And it still sounds fantastic all these years later. Hasn't aged as far as I'm concerned.
No, it's still fantastic. And you got great collaboration between Hodgson and Davies here. And when Hodgson leaves the band later, the band's kind of like falls apart.
Oh, did he? I didn't know that. Oh,
yeah. After they do Breakfast in America, then Brother, Where You Bound? And then after that, one of them leaves the band and the band is not the same.
Yeah, I lost track of it
They go
at that
almost
point.
into like a little funky disco part. It was just terrible. Really terrible. To me, that is peak Supertramp right there.
Fantastic album. I agree.
Yeah. So on to you, Dave.
Okay, well, I haven't moved forward as fast as Richard has chronologically. I'm still stuck in 1967, the year of Expo, Confederation in Canada, the 100th anniversary, the Summer of Love in San Francisco. And my album this time is Forever Changes by the band Love.
Who?
Love.
Who?
Love.
I'm just saying, I had never heard of the band or this album at all.
Well, get ready for a treat. Love were a Los Angeles-based band. And like I mentioned earlier, the musical energy in the United States in the 66-67 period was up in San Francisco, further north. Jefferson Airplane were up there, as were the Grateful Dead, as were Country Joe and the Fish, as was Big Brother and the Holding Company. Notice they like long names up there. That seems to be a thing. Down in Los Angeles, the Doors were out of LA, so that was huge. Very different sound, if you know the sound of these bands. And then there was Love. Okay, so when you listen to Forever Changes, released in November of 1967, so at the end of that banner year, it's got a very different sound to a lot of albums of that year. There's more nihilism to it, as opposed to the kind of poppin', fresh, sunny upbeatedness of the Summer of Love. It's got songs on it like they're terrific, like A House Is Not a Motel. You get a sense of what he's talking about there. Maybe the People would be the Times, or Between Clark and Hilldale. Little slice of life there. The Good Humor Man, he sees everything like this. Bummer in the Summer. It's more acoustic than electric, but every now and then the electric guitar player, whose name I have no idea of, gets involved, and it's fucking great. It has a flavor you won't get anywhere else. Retroactively, it's been looked at as one of the best of the psychedelic albums. I keep using that word because I like psychedelic music. It was not recognized as such at the time. I don't think it performed that well, but it's one of those albums that, like a fine wine, improve with time, and retroactively, people now really love and respect it. I don't think the band went on to do much more. Arthur Lee and his partner in the band fell out, and there were some issues. So if you want to hear music from the band Love, Los Angeles, 1967, Forever Changes is it.
When I saw this on your list, I consider myself pretty knowledgeable about the music, and I had never heard of this. I looked them up, went through. I gave it a quick listen, so it's like I didn't listen to it all through it all because I was going through all my list at the same time too to make sure that everything was worthy to be on the list. And I liked the sound of it. It was very different, and I think I'm going to enjoy this. Now, here's a little trivia for you. Neil Young does the arrangement on the Daily Planet, on the song Daily Planet.
On.
Yeah, Neil Young is there.
Oh, is that fantastic, eh?
Yeah. It's like, would have been around at that time. He had moved to California by then, right?
That's right. He had.
Probably would have come across these guys and hang out in the studio and decide to do some arrangements there.
So much cross-pollination going on.
Yeah, it was fantastic.
There's a terrific, a bit of a sidebar, there's a terrific documentary, I think it was on Netflix, but it might have been somewhere else, called Laurel Canyon.
Oh.
And it's about the Laurel Canyon neighborhood, which is just north of Los Angeles, and all the artists who were kind of living there in the mid-'60s. We're talking, people from the Byrds, the Buffalo Springfield, Jackson Browne, who kind of got famous later, Joni Mitchell, some Grateful Dead members. They all kind of lived in this funky, ramshackle community, and they all just kind of hung out together and cross-pollinated each other's albums. Beautiful documentary to see. I love that period. You can tell probably. Worth looking up.
It's also a movie.
Is it
not
really?
On the same subject?
Oh, okay, not. You had me excited there for a minute. Richard, you're next.
Okay, so I'm next. So I'm going to go full dad mode, right? Because this band is supposedly dad music, and that's Asia by Steely Dan.
Ooh, I don't know. I think it's a fine album.
Oh, I'm not.
Yeah.
I'm not saying I'm not demeaning it or anything, but
Yeah.
like Steely Dan is considered the ultimate dad music. Kids don't listen to Steely Dan, right?
Except, you know where the name came from? I'll do a name
Oh
for
yes,
you now.
you go.
The Family Dildo from William Burroughs' Soft Machine, which I've never read. I just happen to know this piece of trivia.
Okay, I never read Soft. I've read a few things by William Burroughs, but I never
Soft
read
Machine?
Steely Dan. Yeah, it's the appendage.
The Family Dildo. Yeah, anyways.
The Family Dildo,
Have to
yeah.
say that twice.
So Steely Dan, this is their sixth album, comes out 1977, and I remember this when this came out. I mean, the big hit was Peg. I know your number. I got your number. You can put this on from start to finish, and the thing with Steely Dan is, apart from the two main guys, Becker and
Fagan, I think.
yeah, Fagan and Becker, the rest were just studio musicians, and they would hire studio musicians based on the sound that they wanted. So when it came to, let's say, like the solo of a song, they had a particular sound, and they would audition 30, 40, 50 guitarists to come in and say, need a solo here. This is the sound, I need a solo.
Wow.
The guy would play it, and they're like, nah, no. Next. And they would do this. Yeah, they were like
Super perfectionist.
yeah, super perfectionist. You know, Fagan would have had a sound. He's like, I know there's a solo I want here. It has to have this particular thing. So they had a huge amount of musicians that were recruited specifically for the sound they could add to a song. Forget an album. You might have a guy who does a guitar on one song and that's it. That's all he does on the album. And you may have others who play throughout the album. So really, the sound, it is so crafted. And I was listening to the song and I'm like, I got the news. I was listening and I got the news. For some reason, this one's not ringing a bell. So I put it on. It's a bit of a slower song, but man, the hi-hats in that, the drums in that song are just amazing. With headphones on, the cymbals going on, it's just crazy. It's just perfection. There's no fuzz. There's no feedback. It's just everything is so crisp and clean. It must have been really hard for them to. This is why they didn't like performing live.
Well, I was about
because
to say,
it was
I think
hard.
they didn't tour that much, right?
No, they didn't. For the longest time, they didn't like it. And I know that Donald Fagen also had stage fright. He wasn't a big fan of performing in public. So you can see some videos of them performing. It's a bit later on. But early on, they preferred, let's do it in studio. Think of Alan Parsons' project, right? Same sort of thing.
Fair point. Yeah.
But just a fabulous, fabulous album. Black Cow, Asia, Deacon Blues, Peg, Home at Last, I Got the News, and Josie. When Josie Comes Home, it's all right. Just a great album. I remember it from the time, and it's the album my brother told me to buy when I wanted to buy Spanish Train and Other Stories.
Oh, he talked you into Asia? Good choice.
He talked me into Asia. And I told a story in the rock and roll episode where I went, I picked up the record, came home, played it, and it skipped. One of the songs skipped, and I was so happy because I could return it and buy Chris de Burgh. I ended up buying this. This is probably my second or third album. I ended up buying it anyways. But I really wanted the Chris de Burgh Spanish Train and Other Stories. So I went back and
The Folly of Youth.
Oh, yes, exactly. The Fall of Youth. Like, I knew it. I knew Peg. I knew the stuff. But at that particular moment, I was really into something else. But I picked it up, and it's just so playable.
Well, you're right about their perfectionism. You hear it, and you have to listen to it under headphones because all those little sounds that are like a sonic landscape that they had going on. The only artist I can think of, some of his recordings approach that level of complexity, is Stevie Wonder. You just know these guys are like at peak performance. It's just so fat. I don't play the instruments, so I don't have the vocabulary, but all cylinders firing, right?
Yeah, think of Superstition, right?
Yeah, okay.
On headphones, that's just
fantastic.
Blow you away. All right, Dave, back to you.
Okay, what am I doing here?
You left the 60s for this one.
I did. I finally left the 60s
Barely.
with some reluctance. I'll preface this by saying that, in my opinion, 1971, which is where I am now, is really the last year of it's been said, not just by me, that the 60s lasted into about 1971 in the sense of the ethos and the kind of the vibe. And in 1972, it felt like something had changed. And the styles were different. In 1971, and what a year for albums, eh? Sticky Fingers from the Rolling Stones, Marvin Gaye, What's Going On, Led Zeppelin 4, and Who's Next? From The Who. The Who started off in 1965 in London, part of the British Invasion, and were really a singles band. You didn't buy Who albums until 1969's Tommy, if you bought it at all, but they released a string of hit singles. I Can't Explain, My Generation famously. There was Substitute, there was Legal Matter, Pictures of Lily, etc., etc. In 1969, they created the first rock opera. And I've never been a huge fan of the whole Tommy, but there's 2 or 3 songs I would put in, the top song category. Coming out of Tommy, Pete amazingly wanted to do it again. His idea was a second concept album rock opera called Lighthouse. They were unable to pull it off. And the residue of the Lighthouse Project became Who's Next. Released it, I think it was in late 1971. I think it doesn't sound like anything else you'll ever hear. It sounds different to prior Who, and it sounds different to Quadrophenia, which came later. It's one of these song cycles where you really just have to listen to it all the way through. There's not a weak track on it. It starts off with Baba O'Reilly, which, where did that come from? Like, it's out of left field somewhere. Bargain, Love Ain't for Keeping Us Beautiful. On side 2, we're Getting in Tune, Behind Blue Eyes, Going Mobile. You Won't Get Fooled Again as the capper. Oddly, not my favorite song of the album, in my case. Maybe it's because it's been overplayed or something. Yeah. But as a unit, you can hear the power and authority of the band playing together. Keith Moon is a top notch as always. Again, I think as a document of 1971 and what a great 4-piece band could sound like without any bullshit production. Who's Next is it?
Oh yeah, I had this album and it was one of my favorites. This could have been on my list too as a full playthrough. It is just a masterpiece. It's fantastic. And you've got some heavy songs, you've got some lighter songs, you've got some love songs. A great album. In 1971, what a year. Apple has on Apple TV Plus has a documentary series called 1971, The Year That Changed Music Forever.
I've seen it.
It's just fantastic. And I was surprised. I watched it. I was like, wow, all this happened in 71. It's amazing. It's an amazing. And the other amazing thing, my wife was born in 71.
Oh, well, hey. That's a great documentary. Look for that, kids.
Yeah, it's like 6-7 parts, something like that.
Yeah, lengthy enough, eh?
And it gives you a lot of the what was happening to the historical events happening there to a lot of Vietnam protests in there, all kinds of protests. Kind of like the end of, like what 1969 is the end of Flower Power or whatever. Yeah. This is like the ends of it too, the world is really changing in 71.
Richard, over to you.
Okay, so we're going to go into 1970.
And that's the end of part 1. Next Tuesday, part 2 drops on Semi-Retired. You won't want to miss it.